Our speaker tonight is no stranger to Minnesota design. As a curator of design here at the Walker and one of the most influential figures in US graphic design, according to London's Design Museum, Andrew has been responsible for both creating and presenting world-class design here in the Twin Cities for over 15 years. Andrew was design director at the Walker Art Center from 1998 to 2010, and in 2009, under his leadership, the Walker received the National Design Award for Institutional and Corporate Achievement from the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum. This is the first time a nonprofit had ever won this award and joined the likes of Apple, Nike, Target, and Aveda in an award given to institutions that embrace and embody the transformative power of design. In addition to leading the Walker's design studio, Andrew has curated several landmark design exhibitions, bringing international designers to the Twin Cities, not the least of which was Graphic Design Now in Production. Within the next year, he will be presenting 2 more exhibitions here at the Walker, Hippie Modernism, The Struggle for Utopia, and an exhibition exploring skyways, both here at home as well as around the world. As a practicing graphic designer, Andrew's work has received more than 100 design awards. It's been exhibited at New York's Cooper Hewitt, London's Design Museum, of course, among others. His work has also appeared in books, major magazines. His critical writing has appeared in journals and publications that include Emigre and Visible Language. He taught extensively before arriving here at the Walker, and we're very, very fortunate to have him. Andrew previously gave a version of this talk at the 2013 AIGA conference, and he most recently spoke on a panel here at the Walker discussing the nature of Minnesota's and the Midwest brand identity. It is truly my honor to welcome to the stage tonight, Andrew Blauvelt.
Thank you. It's so weird to be the speaker, because I've been programming this for 16 years, so finally, the Susan Lucci of... I talk all around the world, and it's so funny because I've only given 2 official lectures in Minnesota and Minneapolis since I've been here. But I've kind of adopted Minnesota as the home base, and of course I knew about the Walker, and those of you that, and the sad news of the passing of Mildred Friedman last year, I kind of wrote an anecdote about interviewing with Mildred in the 1980s. I've had several flirtations with Minneapolis, positions at MCAD, and then here at the Walker, where I was supposed to, I think, be the designer for film, video, and performing arts. So those departments are really thankful that I didn't get the job, but I came back for years later to interview, and was persuaded to come here and not fear the cold, which was, I came from North Carolina, so you could imagine what the discussion was like. Will it work? Will it not work? But I'm really pleased to be here tonight, and so thank you, Brent, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming out. It's a topic that is quite interesting. I guess I have many different kinds of quotes and thoughts about design in Minnesota. I do travel around the world, and I think people do always ask me, I think we're kind of swept up, we're sort of in that crazed, Minneapolis has finally made it moment, with all of its, we're firsthand, we know its problems, but still the PR, the advanced PR is that it is a really amazing place, and I like to think of it as an ecology, and that ecology includes kind of what I call the big fish. So we have the Fortune 500 companies that have a really outsized presence here, several of which have won those leadership awards like Aveda, like Target, et cetera. And then we also have like boutique firms that are like people have global reputations for creating some of those equally Fortune 500 brands here, and then everything in between. We have a very robust artisanal, what I call the artisanal scene of letterpress printing and silk screening, and keeping all of these forms of graphic design and printing still alive. And so it's that kind of vibrant atmosphere that makes everyone say, well, it's really happening. And one of those things they always reference is, of course, the vitality of the AIJ Minnesota chapter, which is you guys are the model. You want the poster poster child of all other chapters in terms of the amount of activities that happen, but also the participation that everyone has here, from the leading kind of figures, the kind of father figures, I guess, of graphic design, with the youngest participants. You don't get that in other cities, which is really interesting. And so I think that's also what makes Minnesota special. And I told them that, people bond here because we could all die tomorrow. We could all die in this room. So better make friends now. So in my little, I have my water, quote unquote. This is like a Merv Griffin show or something. So this is my water. Thanks, Sally, for buying me my water. So who knows what will happen tonight. But I think I'm supposed to talk to you about a website that we just launched this afternoon called Minnesota by Design. And so that's at walkerart.org/Minnesota by Design. Okay. And all spelled out, all one word. And it's a project that, as Brent mentioned, when AIGA, the national conference, was going to be in Minneapolis, which I had petitioned for a long time, probably to the chagrin of the local chapter in its competition with Design Camp. But I really thought that the national design conference should be in Minneapolis because of all those aforementioned reasons. But I wanted to create a project, and at that same time we were discussing internally how we being architecture and design department, would participate in the Walker's 75th anniversary celebrations, which were largely focused on collections. And that was like one of the ironies, of course, because the Walker's design and architecture department dates to 1940, which is when the Walker went from being the Walker Art Galleries and T.B. Walker's Classical Antiquities to being a contemporary and modern art center. And so it's been in the DNA of the Walker design has since that very inception moment. So, but we've never really had a separate collection called out. In fact, all of our collections at the Walker, it's kind of one big room, as I call it. Some museums have painting collection, a sculpture collection, print collection, et cetera. And the Walker, we kind of keep it all together. We don't have like all of these divisions between things. So we thought it would be a really interesting conceptual challenge of how do you address this notion of what would design and architecture do to participate. And so we had this notion, which I'll talk a little bit more about tonight, which is creating a virtual collection. And so one of the first questions that you have as a curator is, what are the limits? Especially when you say virtual, it sounds like it can be everything and anything. And so we decided to set a geographic boundary to it, at least in this first instance. And so we thought, because the National Design Conference is coming here, we wanted to frame it in terms of Minnesota. What is Minnesota design? So design for Minnesota and design from Minnesota. So one of the things I kind of joked with was, of course, because the crowd was not you. It was like, well, some of you were there, but it was largely people who maybe had not been to the Twin Cities before. And so I was trying to leverage, I guess, some of the classic, I don't know if you call them cliches or images of the Twin Cities. And of course, one of those is Garrison Keillor, that's whatever I got when I came here. Like, oh, is that like Lake Wobegon? I'm like, well, maybe, maybe not. But one of the things I talked about in terms of Minnesota design was this idea that it's the place where all designers are strong, all the work is good looking, and all the clients are above average. And so it has the same problems that Lake Wobegon has in terms of perhaps overestimating itself. But generally true, I think, and that's how a lot of people think about it. So there we are in Google, Google Earth. But this idea of Minnesota design, which is, I think, caught up in this larger conversation around this idea of, are we part of the Midwest? We're not part of the Midwest. We had that whole conclave here about that. And since I grew up in the Midwest in Indiana, I didn't really think of Minnesota as being part of the Midwest because it was basically kind of defined as the Rust Belt. And since it wasn't really, because it was the 80s, and so that was the mindset then. But since Minnesota wasn't steeped in industrial manufacturing in the same way, it didn't really have that kind of what I would call a taint to have to deal with. But what was interesting, shortly after I got here, there started to be a lot of attention focused on what is design in Minnesota. So you had had ID Magazine picking out Minneapolis, St. Paul as being one of the 40, this was their 40 back when they did the top 40 designers and the top 40 clients and that sort of thing. They did a top 40 world design cities, and Minneapolis, St. Paul was included in that. And there's a lot of statistical information to back up this claim, and unfortunately my data is a little old now because I was using the 2000 census and not the 2010 census, but back in 2000, there's always been an outsized number of architects and graphic designers in the Twin Cities for sure. We have about 45% more than the average city, and so you have to think about why that is, and I think it has to do with that composition of the client base here, because that's usually what is the big attractor for a lot of communication industry people. So having, like we're third for Fortune 500 companies in terms of location. So after New York and I think Dallas or Houston, one of those Texas cities, I don't know. So ID Magazine did that. Then Metropolis Magazine, around the time of a lot of the cultural institution expansions around 2005, when the Walker was expanding and the Guthrie was planning their expansion. It wasn't completely done. But there were a lot of things going on in the city, and they created this article called The United State of Design, again, promoting that idea of design in Minnesota. And then Newsweek weighed in as well, so putting us in the design dozen. So there's always been kind of a media attention on the area, and that was coupled by what is intrinsically here. And I've always liked this poster, except today I found out for sure that it was created at the inception of the AIGA chapter from its previous incarnation as the Minnesota Graphic Design Association, with a photograph by Paul Schambroom, which is really cool. I didn't know that before. Really great. So, and the AIGA chapter is, of course, one of the largest in the country, again, speaking to that outsized influence. So getting back to what we came here tonight for, what we recently launched was in that intro video, which I thank Emmett Byrne and Andy Underwood-Belton, who is our videographer in-house, and we worked with Design of the Fourth Dimension in Los Angeles to create that, which was this idea that the Walkers always posed these questions, and because we didn't have this collection, this was also interesting for design. Because I think what happened was, because we didn't have a design collection where we had to worry about, like, how do you take care of this chair or this ashtray or whatever, that we were able to think about design in a much bigger context. We were able to think about what is the social and cultural place of design and to tackle it through issues. And we were publishing Everyday Art Quarterly, which then turned into Design Quarterly, which probably many of you may have seen at the time. And those were focused as case studies on these issues about design. So it was very much what I would call, from a curatorial standpoint, a contextual perspective on what design is, not just caring for an artifact that a lot of maybe decorative arts curators would focus on, the pedigree of its connoisseurship, but rather what is its function, what does it mean, can you have other kinds of objects, does it always have to be about function, can an object be polemical, can it pose a question? So I pulled this one out of from our 75th anniversary website. We have numbered questions. We created all these questions, and does a museum need walls? And that's the one I wanted to focus on for this project. And talking a little bit about history, these are in 1940, when the Walker was formed as a public art center, it was part of the WPA, so the art center, so like the Des Moines Art Center is the other big one that I know of, but the Walker was the biggest of the 70-some art centers that were created during the Depression. And what was interesting about it was the head of the WPA, Daniel Deffenbacher, who's seated on your right on the steps up front, he was the head of the WPA Art Center project for the government. And he chose the Walker to be the place where he wanted to, govern the new museum that would be created, the Art Center. So these are some of the cast of characters, and I just picked out the non-designers. Have a moment of respect for the artist and the educator here. But then the rest of the people were designers. Arthur Carrera, who helped create Magnet Master, which is amazing, like Lego-like toy that the Walker actually produced in the 1940s, or some other figures, William Friedman, who was not associated with Martin Friedman or Mildred, but was the assistant director who was trained as an architect. And Daniel Deffenbacher was also trained as an architect. And then the always camera-shy Hilda Rice. We have no photographs of this person. I mean, there's one from the newspaper, and it's it's kind of funny how, and she's so important. There were so many women involved in creating design and architecture at the Walker, and Hilda was really interesting because she studied at the Bauhaus, and then worked in New York at a couple of industrial design firms, and she had met up with William Friedman and studying at the new laboratory, which I think was an offshoot of Pratt in New York. So at the very inception of the Walker is a very hardcore European influenced modernism that comes to take root here. And one of the first projects that they did was this project called Idea House in 1941. This was Idea House 1, and there was an Idea House 2 as well in 1947. They originally wanted to create 10 idea houses, and this would have been a precursor to something like the case study houses. And they were the first houses built by a museum to be like exhibition homes. So this was for the general public who would pay a little bit of money to tour the home. And they would see new ideas, new and radical ideas, like the breakfast bar, the dishwasher. And, you know, like rooms without walls, you know. So radical concepts in new and modern living. But the real gunshot I heard around the world was in 1946, the Walker opened the Everyday Art Gallery, and this was covered in the New York Times as well. And what was interesting about it was that it was a dedicated space for design, which I believe was actually one of the first museums in the country to dedicate space to design, even before MoMA, which didn't really have a dedicated space, it was doing design shows. And there's a whole parallel discourse that's happening with MoMA at the same time. But the Everyday Art Gallery was interesting because they had that little space in the back where you had the chairs and the tables, and there was actually a phone there. This was, you know, you have to remember it's 1946, so we don't have the internet. So, but you have phones, and then you could pick up the phone and you could call Herman Miller if you wanted the chair that was on display, because you couldn't buy it in a lot of stores in Minneapolis. But they started working with the local retail community, especially at places like Dayton's, and placing modern design within those retail contexts. And then at the same time, they created the journal Everyday Art Quarterly, which is the first museum-based publication about design, and that becomes Design Quarterly. So there's a little bit of a 5-second history of the early days of the Walker, which is why it's steeped in design. But I wanted to talk more specifically about what are the issues around design? Like, why didn't the Walker have a design collection, and what's happening with design collections? So there's a little brief survey through this. Of course, it depends what your definition of design is. I have a very broad one, which is anything basically that's created by man or humans for the built environment. And so it includes lots of professional activity, but also includes non-professional activity. But in cases like this at the Metropolitan Museum, the Temple of Dendor, you know, this is a ruin that's been placed inside this. They, in fact, created the shell around it, and so this is starts suggesting questions of context, right? This is sitting in the middle of Central Park. So how do you understand design's context if you remove the object from its kind of everyday existence or its everyday life? And of course, as a design curator, you always deal with this issue. Once you take something out of a context and put it into a new context, you can call attention to it, but you're also robbing it maybe of its essential kind of, raison d'etre. Or something closer to home. An example would be closer to home, the lodge or the dining hall at Nana Bijou, which is in our collection. And it's, of course, I assume, how many people have been? A lot, yes. You should go if you haven't. My favorite description, it was like Art Deco psychedelia. Because this is kind of this interpretation of, like, you know, Native American design, but like on an acid trip. But but from 1929, is a French artist who created the essentially painting wall murals. Would be a great example of, like, you know, it's so rooted in its context on the North Shore that it would be bizarre to kind of see this thing disembodied, although I suppose you could do it, and of course museums do take whole rooms and show them. Another interesting conundrum is, what if it's too big, right? So this is the 747. This was the first landing of the 747 commercial airliner. And what's interesting is that the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Paolo Antonelli, wants to put this in the collection. And so it's kind of interesting because, you know, like, you know, the Air and Space Museum has, you know, spacecraft and airplanes. So, obviously they figured out a way. But what's interesting about Paolo is that she wants, and MoMA's, they want to acquire it while it's still in service. So they would find a plane, and then maybe it would have like the ascension number painted on the side. I don't know if is it the FCC, I don't know, whatever that governmental body that controls aircraft would go along with that. But so you have this practical questions of like where would you put it? We have small sculptures that we can't even seem to find room for, so like where would you do with it? But Paolo has solved this rather brilliantly by just saying it remains in service, so it would just continue functioning, so it would be flying around the country. So I think our example, my conundrum would be, and Brent mentioned it, as I'm working on a Skyways exhibition for next January, and so the Skyway system is very unique structure, but not as unique as you might think if you come to the show and read the book, but that it is obviously a very integral part of the identity in the Twin Cities. But then because it's an extensive system, meaning that it's an in-between system, it includes footbridges, and then you can't really separate out like the crystal cord from the Skyway system, right? So it's got all this ambiguity to it that I think makes an interesting notion about like how would you do that if it's an important object? How might you collect it? Also at MoMA, Paolo's on a tear to create all these conundrums for herself. So they actually did acquire the @ symbol. And since this is a room of graphic designers, I bet you had the same question that I did when they announced this. I was like, which @ symbol? And I think this is some terrible font, but it's like Arial or something. Like, really? You could have picked a better one for this. But, obviously this is a conceptual problem, right? So that, because like a lot of people don't understand like letter forms and typography, letter forms and characters really can't be copyrighted. That's the problem with fonts, right? Because language is supposed to be universal access. And so each variation, it has like a million different versions, like every letter A is a separate thing. So like, of course, I had the same question, like what font did they collect? But it's really about collecting the concept of it and acknowledging the significance of this character, which does have a specific history to it, which then has been completely transformed because of the internet and email. So, so the question here is, what are you acquiring exactly? And I think here, it's often these questions have to do with things that are immaterial. And so one of the big transformations that we've had in post-industrial society is that we moved from the notion of product design to the notion of service design. And this is where you'll start seeing more of this activity. Like you'll start seeing more programs. Instead of having product design, they'll have service design now, because it's the largest segment of the economy when you think about it, that we're really not a country that manufactures things anymore, but we're a country that creates services and experiences as a large part of that economy. And so in this example, this is an image taken from a video from the Mayo Clinic Center for Innovation. And this used to be called the Spark Lab, and Mayo Clinic in Rochester was really forward-looking in terms of understanding what we could now call design thinking and innovation, working at this point early on with IDEO, the consultancy in California, who was the major champion of this kind of thinking and methodology, and then applying it specifically to the instance of healthcare and healthcare experience, so healthcare provision and then also patient care experience. So, but what would you collect? I kind of secretly joke you end up with like 26,000 Post-it notes because they're constantly ideating. And then how would you preserve them? But it's an important aspect of design, and an increasingly important one as we look into the future. So the ideas of immateriality also influence how design museums are thinking about collecting. This is a project called Planetary, which is an app that the Cooper Hewitt, I think it's their first app that they acquired. It's an app that's no longer actually live, but they did acquire it. But of course, the question is, how do you conserve it? Because as if you're involved in technology, the problem of like the support system that undergirds applications of any sort would be the major issue. And what they did, which I thought was very interesting, is that they put the source code on GitHub, which is the kind of consortium, open source kind of consortium where people can study the code, but they could also contribute to it. And I think what they're thinking is that they can contribute to its preservation, and in terms of like how do you keep this thing going in the future. And so it's more like open source computing, so treating a proprietary application more like open source computing. For us, we have other problems. like the Honeycrisp apple, which I always like to call out as an example of great Minnesota design. And you may be thinking, but Andrew, wait, that's an apple. And it's not just any old apple, though. I mean, it was intentionally created. It's a cultivar, so it's across, it's a traditional, it's not like a genetically modified organism. It's a traditional cultivation, crossbreeding kind of method for creating a new apple that would have properties of sweetness and tartness, but it would also have a very long shelf life, which had to do with the distribution in the marketplace. And so they created not just the apple, of course, the product, but they also have to create all the branding around it, including the name of Honeycrisp, right? And they're also then, therefore, once they carve out, and they're very successful, obviously, so once they create the marketplace, dominate the marketplace, they also have to be, just like many drug companies, 10 steps ahead of what the competitors are doing, but also what happens when that plant patent expires, what will be on the shelf next. And so that's why you're seeing the Zest Stars and I don't know what the latest one is, but there's a whole succession of these successor apples as being part of it. But that whole notion of food design is a really important new category. Just like service design, you're going to see many more programs starting up in the idea of food design. That's an interdisciplinary program around food science, but also packaging and branding and other elements that come together to create that. And that's very important for Minnesota if you think about things like General Mills or Pillsbury, now they're one entity, but also things like the extension at the U. So it's a very important aspect of Minnesota's future. Ephemeral things, of course, that's the other problem, right, with the apple. It's like, well, what do you do if you collect them? Do you change it every 10 days? Or, well, this one you could probably keep for a few months. That would be good. But, what would be the problems or issues around collecting that? And I guess that's also true for things like ice architecture. This is the rather amazing first ice carnival in St. Paul in 1886, which there was a prime where the perfect storm of like a smallpox epidemic in Montreal, which had dominated the winter tourism markets, and the emerging city of St. Paul, which was the fastest growing city in the United States in the late 1800s. So, the city fathers, a group of people got together. Well, how do we capitalize on this moment? And they created this amazing ice palace. Which is really quite amazing. So quite taken with that one. But I call all of this stuff, all of these conundrums, the uncollectibles from a curatorial standpoint. And how might you deal with this if you were trying to propose a collection? So I thought it would be interesting. When this opportunity occurred, I was thinking back to a project actually in my past, right before I came to the Walker in 1997, hosted a history conference in Chicago called Remaking History. And there, Michael Rock and Susan Sellers, who later formed the design firm 2x4 in New York, they weren't so busy at the time working for Prada, so they had a little bit of spare time. So they created a conceptual project called Museum of the Ordinary, which I thought was really extraordinary, which was this concept that this whole city, instead of creating a physical building, you could annex a city. And by annexing a city, you could call attention to the objects in the space of the city, just like a museum would. But it would be different kinds of design, what I call design problems, like how do you make someone aware that they're actually in the Museum of the Ordinary? Well, they solved that in this case through a little Photoshop magic by these billboard trucks that drive around the city welcoming people to the Museum of the Ordinary. And in this case, they picked several blocks in Soho to be their site or their museum building. And so they would annex, there would be buildings, manhole covers, payphones, again, this is 97, other objects, and then they would figure out ways of creating didactics or information displays for those objects. Unfortunately, it never came to fruition. It only existed as a proposal. So that's unfortunate. But I did, in digging a little deeper, find an example from another museum in New York. This was right before the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum opened in 1976 as part of the American Bicentennial. They created a project called Immovable Objects that was created by Robert Mangurian of Works when he was in New York, actually, at the time, and Keith Goddard, kind of famous graphic designer also in New York, and they had collaborated a lot with Craig Hodgetts and other people in California. But they created this exhibition that would take place in Lower Manhattan, and it took on many different forms, including, choosing pieces of architecture to put on display, creating a parade for people to participate in, and they actually had the architects choose their favorite building or one that they had designed, and then made the costumes to be part of that parade and display. And this was kind of gives you an idea of the route that it took. It was just over a mile long. And they solved the problem of communicating about it by creating this newsletter, newsprint, like a cheap newspaper, where they would expose aspects that are invisible to most of the public, like issues of zoning, like how do buildings get shaped? It's not just from the head of the architect, it's also from the hands of the law, constraining what can be done, or the origin of the skyscraper itself and dealing with the port of Manhattan that they had. So I'm going to show you some of the website that we created with these kinds of projects in mind, but I wanted to show you sort of our conceptual sketches for what might be possible before I launch into the website demo. But some of the things we're talking about is like we have a campaign whereby we're exposing to the public some of these aspects of Minnesota design, like a train stop campaign or a billboard campaign. Henry Dreyfuss's round thermostat designed for Honeywell when it was based in Minneapolis. Or could you, so those are old forms, right? Print media, outdoor media, but could you use new forms of technology like augmented reality to rediscover the Minneapolis from the past? There was a huge moment in Minneapolis, unfortunately, during the urban renewal craze that wiped out large sections of the city. So a lot of these really amazing structures no longer exist, but could you use technology to augment people's experience of it? So I'm going to launch into the website to give you a little tour. And that's the URL. Just a little explanation. So these are just some stills. So it's a bifurcated website with two choices that you can enlarge to full view, the gallery view or the map view. And so we geolocate the projects that we selected. And again, these are just about 100 and I forget how many we had, 100, less than 120, more than 100, somewhere between 100 and 120 projects that seed this collection. So those are my choices. But we also have a nomination form on the website that you can suggest things that we should include as part of this collection. So in gallery view, which you can then sort in different ways, kind of by discipline or by field. And or you can retain the split screen mode and kind of locate. There's a lot of landscape projects that are part of it, like Jackson Meadow. I'm going to quit here, so you might think we're coordinating this. So I'm just like going to go here, and then I need to go there. Are we live? Yay! Oh wait. Oh, there we go. Should I? Is that, oh good, it's showing up. It's dangerous being live. So, I know, there's multiple backups though, don't worry. So this is kind of my blah, blah, blah preamble, which I've just given you about it, and then I'm gonna expand it into gallery mode. And then you can sort by type, so we have architecture, so then it gives you those architecture examples. You could do branding, another big component of Minnesota. I guess you get the idea. Some of the more interesting ones, like game design, who knew? Nerf, yes, Minnesota. Funny story with that. Do you know the Nerf ball story? Yeah. So the guy who developed, let's go investigate. So the guy who invented Twister, Ryan Geyer, and this was a really funny story. So he's working in an ad firm in St. Paul. I know, there wasn't that homoerotic tension, I guess, in the 1960s when they did this shot. But so the Twister has an early story too. So this was basically conceptualized as a promo for a company, I guess Inc. or something, totally unrelated to this. It's back in those days of advertising. So you create this whole game for it, but it became a game, right? So they thought it had legs, so to speak, for commercial application. And so it was all going good, and they had all the games made, and And then there was the they started getting wind that there was this sexual kind of connotation to the whole game, as they were very nervous about this in terms of how it would go out live. And then they got cold feet and they kind of canceled it. But they forgot to tell the promo guy, the sales and promotion guy, and they had scheduled Johnny Carson and Zsa Zsa Gabor to play Twister on The Tonight Show. And then, of course, they didn't know that it was canceled, so they just went ahead and did it. And it became an overnight sensation because you could imagine Zsa Zsa Gabor and Johnny Carson convorting on the game board. And so then, of course, it was successful. And then what's really unusual about this is that the same guy, like apparently there's like a rule in game design where you can only have one hit. So make sure it's a good one if you're doing but he had two big hits because he also created the Nerf ball when he was... They were trying to create another game, and this is one of those great stories where you're thinking, oh my God, who thought this would be a good idea? But the game was, apparently there were styrofoam rocks, and there was money that would be hidden under the styrofoam rocks, and there were like guys dressed as cavemen. And somehow they were staging this, and then during the break, one of the cavemen, I guess, shot a basket with one of the rocks because they had like the hoop up. And so the guy got this idea that, oh, hey, we could have an indoor ball, right? Which was really important because it was made out of soft foam so it wouldn't break your lamps, right? So for the moms who are buying the games, this was really important. So he had two hits. So he's kind of mythologized in the game world. Of course, other important, recreation, of course, important. So you probably know about rollerblades, right? Minnesota, so inline skating, of course, for the hockey season, off-season training becomes a recreational kind of hit and defines basically the 1980s. And then, of course, water skis were also invented here in Lake Pepin. A lot of people think they were done in Florida because the guy in Florida had the big show, but actually they were done here. And he was a big advocate for that. So let me fly around here. So as I said, food design was another. Whoops. Oh no, Eric. No. Let me go back to all. Okay, so you get some sense of this. So this is all intermixed and by alphabetical order. But we've had, things that you may be aware of, like the Aeron chair. I don't know if many people know that, but Bill Stump was based here in Minneapolis and created several chairs. One of my favorites is actually Betty Crocker. Total confabulation of there is no real Betty Crocker and there never was, but it was a composite character right from the beginning. So there was a contest to have the name, and so Betty was selected and Crocker was a reference to somebody who worked in the company. But then they also had a contest amongst the female staff for the signature, because the signature was basically kind of the logo at the time. And so it still is, I guess. And then so that became the basis of it. But what's interesting is that they have to adapt Betty, right, to the times, and so this is looking over a long arc of history. And the last portrait that this shows is from 1996, which is really interesting because it's a computerized composite of all the qualities that would be in the ideal Betty Crocker. So this is the advance of Photoshop and morphing and blending different races and genders. So this is really interesting that it starts out as a composite in the 1920s and retains its composite nature like decades later. I'm trying to think. I always liked the Cray supercomputer. I have a soft spot for technology. So Minnesota was actually known as being a supercomputing center, and Cray was one of the leading companies for that. I just love the fact that this is a computer. That's also a piece of room furniture too. So the seating element at the bottom is the air conditioning unit, because the thing got so hot because it's brilliant. A brilliant design. It's this kind of C shape, but they had to have this huge cooling capacity. Something Apple needs to learn from its heat transfer technique. It isn't quite so great sometimes, but this is just really funny that they converted it into a piece of lounge furniture, and then you could go inside the C part, the counter part of the form. Did you know Draw Me? Here, this was really surprising. So in 1914, what is essentially the engraving, so the Bureau of Engraving, the money guys, sense that there's a shortage of draftsmen in the country and that they should open an art school. And so they create, and this comes a little later, obviously, but when they start, commercializing this notion of basically, can you draw this, and then this would be your lead in, and they still exist, actually, the successor version of that school. And of course, there's actually heritage wear is really strong right now, so Duluth Pack. So this was the original patent application for Duluth Pack, which had the extra strap that would be placed around your head here. A very important, I understand, for porting canoes and making sure that you keep your balance, right? And then the pack that's a square fits into the bottom of the canoe too. So all really about today's world. I also like to show like two examples of the. Where did it go? Okay, we'll do some interesting ones here. Ice House. Do you guys know about Ice House? Super cool, right? So here's. So and. Yeah, it's stunning. And so this is Gianni Patana, who is a member of the radical architecture group in Italy in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And he gets an assignment to be an artist in residence at MCAD in 1971. And he creates these projects there, in which he's basically creates a mold. He also did a school too. And so he created the mold around the building and then allowed both the snow and the ice to form. Which is just a really stunning, I think, concept and idea. Of course, one that's difficult to collect. I have to pay homage to the Twin Cities punk rock scene, and so those of you who don't know, Grant Hart, who's was a member of Husker Du, created the logo for the band, and he studied basically printing and metal typesetting at St. Paul High School, and basically created like a proofing print of this in Helvetica, and then had substituted the umlauts for the long, what's called a macron, which is the long, like a long vowel, a bar over a vowel, because Husker Du is a reference to a board game, and so the board game's word mark has those long vowels on it. So this is actually technically incorrect, I understand, if you're a Norwegian, but you can clue me in. But this is a memory game, like do you remember is how it translates. But of course he creates the tear and then draws over the whole thing in a marker because he has printed it in orange. So this is for the older people in the crowd. So back in the day, in instant printing or paper plate printing, so like if you had orange, it would be really difficult to use that as a template for the mechanical to expose it, if you know what I mean. So he drew on top of it with a black Sharpie. But then he gets all the elements of hardcore punk in this one logo, which is really amazing. The tear, the hand-drawn typography, and the umlauts, right? So this is, you can't have Motley Crue without Husker Du, although they probably won't appreciate that reference. Let's see, what else do we have here? Oh, image design. This is really great. Oh, there it is. Okay, so InterDesign, of course, is Peter Seitz' firm after he departs the Walker Art Center and creates what I believe is the first truly interdisciplinary design firm in the country. So it's a consortium of product design, architecture, landscape architecture, and of course graphic design with Peter, but then also systems analysts. So this was the early use of technology, and so he wins the competition for the Minnesota Zoo, in part because they have somebody on staff that can do site analysis using computers, and so he was a big champion of the computer. The first issue of, if you go really far back in 1966, there's the issue of Design Quarterly that's called Design in the Computer. So it's 1966. So you have to remember that this is like mainframe computing at that time. So very, very far advanced. He's also the first person, I believe, to place an ad or a listing in the Yellow Pages as graphic designer in Minneapolis. Funny. And then there's this land of 10,000 mascots, like the Jolly Green Giant, which is, again, really interesting because he's created by Leo Burnett, who's the famous advertising guru, when Leo is just starting out working on another company. And then he gets this really he's like bear skin. he's scowling, apparently, and so this does not test well with the housewives. So they have to modify him, but it's really intriguing analysis of how do you crop him so that he still appears like a giant but is friendlier, and then of course they add the word jolly to it too, which then helps you think about it in a different context. Now owned by General Mills. I don't know if you guys have seen this one. This is Carticulate, who were two geographers from the University of Wisconsin who were in the Twin Cities for a little while and then are in New York now. So in 2011, they took on the daunting yet impossible challenge of creating wayfinding and navigation for the Minneapolis Skyway system. And so they were aligning, using the metaphor of the subway system as a way of understanding and navigating the Skyway system, which I thought was a really interesting thing. And if you want to know why we can't have wayfinding and true total navigation within the Skyway system, you should come next January 2016 to my exhibition, but I'm not going to give it away. Paul Bunyan is another one of these mascot figures, which actually has a Walker connection. There's a hotly contested debates between Maine and Minnesota about the origins of Paul Bunyan. But that aside, I think Minnesota leads in terms of its first application, the first visualization of Paul Bunyan. Paul Bunyan had been a character in folklore, stories told around the campfire in logging camps, and then became kind of this childhood folklore. But in Minnesota, T.B. Walker, who was a lumber baron, had the Red River Lumber Company, and their marketing guy suggested that they should adapt this character and then visualize him. So they created the first illustrations of him, and more importantly, created the innovation of having Babe the Blue Ox as part of it. So that's part of that whole story, which is interesting, I think. And there's just so many things, like where do you even go? Where should I go next? I don't know. Do you see anything? You know, the replacements, some on the music thing. So, yeah, this is, again, another quintessential example. So it's kind of like the Beatles' White Album. There's like nothing, it's blank, and then hand-stamped all the copies, right, of it. Again, hand-stamping, the typography, the degradation of the type, those are all things that feed into the punk and post-punk graphic scene. I already talked to you about that. Okay, I don't know. We have an anime. Oh, this might take forever to load, actually. So we also have contemporary things. So, of course, Non-Format, who operates between St. Paul and Oslo, Norway, created this visual identity, which is a really interesting problem in itself of videography and capture, motion capture, to create an identity for a design competition in Norway. But I think I should wrap it up, shouldn't I? Yes. Are we going to do questions? Okay. Sorry, I should have planned that better. So check it out online, and then if you have ideas for nominations, then I will try to, when I recover from we had to launch 2 websites today, so I'm a little exhausted. But we will attend to those requests and try to do our best to update the site as we go along. And so we, of course, want you to share it with all your friends and try to get the word out about it, because I think it does do a service to help promote the idea of design in Minnesota. So thank you.